Welcome to SilviCast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Greg Edge.
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
And we are both silviculturists with Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show.
Hey, Gregor, have you seen my keys?
Not again, Brad. No, I have not seen your keys.
All right. Well, they're not on the tire. Okay, let me see here. We parked.
Yes, we parked.
I got out, I got my cruising vest, closed the back hatch. I usually put the keys right here on the front driver's side tire, right on that top. I don't know, maybe they fell behind. Let me check.
Why do you keep storing your keys on the front tire? Put them in your pocket like the rest of us.
Well, Greg, I could get a hole in my pocket, and if you get back to the truck before me, you can get in, right? So I don't know. That's a good thing.
Oh, man. Last week, you lost your keys for an hour while we were hunting. This is a pattern, Brad. You've got 20 minutes. We're meeting Chris in 20 to talk about ecological memory, ironically.
All right. Well, maybe it was the back tire.
Are you sure you didn't put them in a different hiding place this time?
No, wait, here they are. They were in my pocket.
Oh, Lord, help me. Brad, do you know what happens when a forest starts losing its memory?
Is this like a joke? Okay, I'll answer it as a joke. What does it start taking ginkgo biloba? Da-dum-dum.
Good one. No, it doesn't. But if we get going, we might just make our conversation with Chris Webster, professor at Michigan Tech's College of Forest Resources and Environmental Science. Chris will be able to tell us what happens when a forest starts losing its memory. Its ecological memory, to be more precise, and tell us how thoughtful silviculture can help prevent that loss. I'm afraid, however, Brad, it will not help you with your key problem.
Yeah, Gregor, it always works out. Have we ever really been stuck?
Well,
wait. Don't answer that. Don't answer that. This season of SilviCast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company, McCoy Construction and Forestry, and the Family Forest Carbon Program. You make the SilviCast world go round, so thank you. Chris Webster, welcome to SilviCast. I know a lot of our listeners are probably former students of yours or are really familiar with your work, but maybe for those who aren't familiar with you, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of quantitative ecology at Michigan Technological University. I'm in the College of Forest Resources and Environmental Science. And, pretty much I have really broad interest when it comes to kind of forest and ecological systems. And I've worked in, throughout northern Wisconsin, Indiana, southern Appalachians, and up here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And then, a few other places in between.
What got you into thinking about forestry, forest management, forest ecology?
So I've always been fascinated by, kind of natural communities and plant communities, wildlife. And so I got my start, I went to Purdue for my undergrad and, for lack of a better reason, I majored in wildlife just because, the idea of being outdoors and working in natural systems was super appealing, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so over the course of my time there, I had a lot of great experiences working for graduate students, working for professors. I loved identifying plants. I loved kind of being in the forest. And so over time, I just gravitated more and more towards kind of ways that I could blend kind of wildlife and forestry or just kind of look at how plant communities work. And I'm just inherently fascinated by kind of how plant communities work and how systems kind of function. And unfortunately, in some cases, why they don't function.
Yeah. I didn't know that you went to Purdue for your undergraduate, Chris. We do a lot of things with folks from Purdue. They got a great program, do a lot of neat forestry work down there.
Yeah, so I did my undergrad and then my master's there. My master's was more in forestry, and then I went on to University of Wisconsin-Madison for my PhD.
All right, Madison grad.
Give a shout out to Craig Lorimer, my advisor. Tremendous influence on me, and then my advisor, George Parker at Purdue University, both of whom are retired now.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Chris, because the one thing that came out, and we'll get to your talk that you did at our Wisconsin SAF meeting recently, But one thing that came through from a ton of the speakers was looking at some of that work that Craig Lorimer did was really fundamental in setting us up for where we are now and our understanding of old growth characteristics or just how a lot of our systems work.
Yeah, I think he was really ahead of his time on a lot of those topics.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, no, I learned a tremendous amount from him. And, every time I see him, I blame him for my success.
Yeah, Craig was there when I started grad school. It was kind of towards the tail end of his time there. But yeah, just like Brad said, his work was ahead of its time. It was foundational. So
Yeah.
we really are big fans of Craig. As Brad said, Chris, you were at our recent SAF statewide on ecological silviculture, and you did a talk kind of on a paper that you wrote a while ago. I believe it was 2018, kind of talking about this concept of ecological memory, which really intrigued both Brad and I. And we've had conversations about this off and on for quite some time. So we wanted to talk to you about that and kind of talk to you about your presentation that you gave at SAF. So I guess a good place to start would be talking about what is ecological memory. So what is this concept? Because it was kind of new to us.
Yeah, so it's a neat concept. It's actually been around for a long time, but it was really kind of around 2017 that I really started thinking about it. That paper was a collaboration with a whole bunch of really amazing co-authors, and we started talking about kind of, these different systems we work in and kind of the lack of predictability. That there are silvicultural systems that used to be relatively reliable. As they're being applied, there's this kind of lack of predictability in terms of what's going to happen. And one of the ideas that kind of came out of that was this idea, which was, it's been, in the ecological literature for a long time, but kind of more recently, it kind of been started to be applied to forestry, is this idea of ecological memory. And it's essentially kind of the legacy effects and kind of the system dynamics that kind of allow a system to basically recover from disturbance and kind of return to a relatively predictable state. Not necessarily the previous state, but return kind of predictably and maintain a trajectory. And so it's this combination of kind of information legacies, which are really adaptations and traits that the species within that community have to a particular disturbance regime. And then what are called material legacies, which are kind of the physical things, the plants, soils, the coarseway debris, all these kind of material pieces of the system that allow the system to kind of reorganize following disturbance.
So just so I get this straight, so like an informational memory would be something like a trait of a species. So in our northern hardwoods, for example, would that be something like yellow birch that has these particular silvical traits of growing on exposed soil, like on tip-up mounds or that kind of thing? Is that more of a material?
So the trait, so having species in the system that respond, so a lot of our northern hardwood forests are kind of wind-driven systems in terms of the predominant disturbance regime.
Mm-hmm.
And so having species in that system that have traits that basically allow them to colonize successfully following wind events. So say on tip-up mounds or in large gaps or kind of gap environments, so things like yellow birch, so kind of mid-tolerance, that sort of trait, or in kind of low frequency disturbances, kind of small wind events or individual tree mortality, having shade tolerance. So species that can build up in the understory and then be ready to basically move to the canopy when small gaps are created. And so there's those kind of, so it can be different species. So shade tolerance, hemlock, very shade tolerant, sugar maple, very shade tolerant. In parts of the northern hardwood range, of course, American beech, very shade tolerant. And so shade tolerance can be one of those traits. Certain adaptations to microsite conditions or disturbances can also be things that are really useful for allowing the system to kind of respond and recover to, say, a stand reinitiating windstorm or small canopy gaps that are formed by, smaller scale events.
Mm-hmm. Just teasing it out in my mind too. It's like little things that you called it reorganization, but it's really like when that thing occurs, when this disturbance occurs, it's going to help guide it back into like maybe this path that it was probably on historically instead of just taking any path whatsoever.
Yeah, yeah. So there's some predictability. Natural systems are inherently kind of stochastic, and
Right,
we gave up, I think, a long time ago about thinking about like steady states.
right.
That these things are, kind of really long-term stable, but trajectories are relatively stable, at least historically. So, certain types of disturbances generate certain types of plant communities. And so that's kind of that memory in the system that, the system will respond a certain way to a certain kind of level or intensity of disturbance, assuming you have kind of this mix of traits in the system. And then you've got these material legacies available to basically allow kind of recolonization and recovery.
Hmm.
Kind of goes to that term we use often now of resilience. So just being able to move back right into a state that it was before after that disturbance.
Exactly. Yeah. The more memory you have in the system, the more resilient the system is going to be to various types of disturbances.
Yeah. And memory feels like a more approachable term because resilience can have lots of different meanings and lots of things like that, but it feels like it's something you can actually grab onto or understand
Mm-hmm.
about like, oh, this is something about it that it should, it's part of it. So,
Yeah, I really like the term memory in terms of how it's used in this particular case because you start talking about legacy effects, and there's lots of legacy effects, and there's good legacies and bad legacies. Memory kind of is, in a way, I mean, maybe it's intangible, but it's a little more useful in terms of thinking about the conditions that existed prior to the disturbance, and then how do they
Mm-hmm.
inform or influence how the system is going to respond to that disturbance.
right.
The term is actually kind of an old term. It goes back to kind of thinking about aquatic systems, thinking about kind of how systems respond generally to disturbance. And then you'll even see kind of ecological memory or kind of that idea of memory in other kind of system dynamics. So kind of that ability of systems to kind of bounce back, or at least again, maintain a trajectory.
Yeah.
You and your co-authors, I think you mentioned this earlier, started this conversation with we have forests, particularly in our northern hardwood forests, that maybe aren't reacting the way that we had anticipated them to react. And so that kind of goes to maybe there's a loss of that memory, right? That then causes them not to be able to respond in the way that we hope they would respond. So that kind of brings up this whole concept of what are some of those losses in memory that we're seeing that are now impacting maybe how we manage our forests.
Yeah, so there's a number of causes, for the loss of memory in these systems. So what seems to be happening in a lot of cases is that we're kind of eroding the memory out of the system. In some cases, it's unintentional. In some cases, we've kind of inadvertently done it. So there's a number of different things that do degrade memory. Those can be invasive species, which come in and kind of fundamentally change how the system is going to respond to disturbance because you have new players essentially that are going to take the place of species that we have. We lose a lot of memory in our northern hardwood forest from disease and pest insects that
Mm-hmm.
really change kind of the whole composition of the forest. So the loss of ash due to emerald ash borer, just the completely different kind of dynamics of American beech now following the invasion of beech bark disease.
Mm-hmm.
And, more broadly, the loss of, you know, in the East Coast, the loss of chestnut throughout the Appalachians, oak wilt, changing kind of dynamics in oak systems. And so there's a number of different disease and pests that really change kind of the propagules or the species that are available. And that changes, how the system is going to respond then when you have disturbances. There are other things like exotic earthworms, which are really a kind of a wicked problem because it's not like you can get rid of them, which really fundamentally change kind of conditions in the understory. They change mycorrhizal relationships. They change kind of the water holding capacity of the soil. And that really has broad consequences in terms of shifting composition or not allowing the system to kind of respond as it would have historically with kind of the mix of species that are available. We've also lost memory through selective removal of certain species. There's a lot of forests and lake states, even northern hardwood stands, where you can walk through and you see these massive old kind of rotted white pine stumps. and there's no white pine alive in that stand.
Hmm.
And so, that piece, that kind of ability to respond in that case to really large infrequent fires or really large wind events with this kind of mid-tolerant pine, that's gone from a lot of our forest. And so we kind of lose these individual pieces. We lose certain microsites that are desirable for certain species. And cumulatively, those really start to change how the system responds when you do get a disturbance. And silviculturally, when we create a disturbance with the idea that we're going to create conditions that are ideal for this suite of species, we create that disturbance, and then we get something completely different than what we expected.
Hmm. Yeah, I think of historically the cutover of being a big loss of ecological memory in terms of things like you mentioned. We harvested and extracted species preferentially, like hemlock, even yellow birch, white pine. And so we find those lacking of those seed sources in some areas. And I know, Brad, you and I, we've worked in southern Wisconsin,
Yep.
and those forests have seen a history of grazing, for instance, that have really changed what's available in terms of species, both in the overstory and understory.
I wonder, so maybe the cutover, like here in Wisconsin, upper Midwest, the cutover started it. But even well-intentioned silviculture probably has a negative impact because we're not providing for those pieces or that memory, say through the coarse woody debris that would be left behind, or those favoring certain species. Or so inadvertently, I think, what's that saying? We met the enemy and he is us. So I think in a way, we're probably part of it too. I'm looking at you, Greg. Maybe not Chris and I, but you.
Hey,
I'm
wait a
looking at
minute.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a very open-minded forester, Brad.
Yeah. Okay. We'll give you that. Yeah.
There's always kind of this interaction kind of with the agricultural paradigm when we think about forestry. And there's a lot of reasons silviculturally, that simple systems seem really desirable. And so, we may really be featuring a certain species because it's particularly valuable or it has a particular uh, trait that we're interested in terms of, wood quality, or, it grows really well on a certain site. And over time, that kind of push towards monoculture, I think in some of these systems has been problematic. Again, because we're kind of reducing the pool of potential species that we can work with and the pool of species that might respond to disturbances that are a little bit different than what we anticipate. The other thing is these systems are constantly changing. And so they're getting more and more complex in terms of how they're going to respond to all these different stressors in terms of invasives, pests and diseases, changing climatic conditions, and then also changes in terms of the goods that we want out of those in terms of ecosystem services and also timber products.
And I think that's kind of the emphasis of our SAF meeting and ecological silviculture was silvicultural systems and treatments to try to maybe maintain a greater diversity of those elements or that memory, right? Because traditional silvicultural systems sometimes simplified that.
Yep. And just a note for anyone who wasn't there, you missed a great meeting. Maybe next year you can get in on the act and have fun with everybody, but it was a really good meeting. There were a lot of really good presentations. And what I always enjoy about these is you always pull something out. And so like what we're talking about today with ecological memory, I heard people talking about ecological memory over a beer later. So I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, no, definitely there were some folks that followed up with me afterwards, kind of asking more questions about it. So it's been a fun conversation. And I think it does make some of these kind of like really challenging problems in terms of regeneration dynamics, in terms of kind of predictability of silvicultural systems. It gives you a kind of a way to talk about it that, is, I guess, maybe not quite as technical, but kind of allows you to kind of think more kind of holistically about the system and think about parts of the system that we often don't pay that much attention to, like the understory and kind of, one of the things I talked about in that talk and that, my co-authors and I in that paper really focused on was that, often the understory is the harbinger of kind of things kind of being out of place and heading in the wrong direction. So, kind of paying more attention to what's going on in the understory, paying attention to what's happening to herbaceous plants, to wildflowers and their populations declining sometimes can be a good indication that, there are things shifting in the understory that are going to have consequences when we go to regenerate.
That's a conversation you and I have quite often, Brad, is as foresters, we're often focused on that overstory
Right.
and the changes in those species composition there, but we're not paying attention to the understory as much. We pay attention to tree regeneration, but not as much the herbaceous layer and kind of the changes going on there.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to put more focus there, is what I think.
I could see a part of forestry in the future kind of really dealing with restoration of that understory, because there's so many places where through the grazing, through maybe lots of other changes, maybe really severe fires historically, something like that, it's removed those seed sources. And so we don't have that. It's kind of reintroducing that, I don't know what you do, like rebuilding a memory, right? Like just trying to put something back in place that might contribute toward the way the system is, kind of would work historically.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. You can think about kind of how do you restore some of these memories and systems, and then the other thing is how do you avoid creating bad memories? And so, we can restore memory in some systems. There's some limitations, obviously, but, provisioning for coarse-area debris, a lot of the themes from kind of ecological forestry in terms of thinking about legacies, think about legacy retention, thinking about keeping seed sources, keeping, potentially large old trees, because, they have potentially genetic adaptations that may be useful, that they persisted on site for so long. And so kind of thinking broadly about kind of what we leave behind, uh, and then thinking, kind of carefully about not creating bad memories in terms of, uh, resulting in compaction, selectively removing a certain species, or, bringing in an exotic organism inadvertently on skidder tires or something like that. So there's a lot of ways that we can try to provision for creating memories, but also try to avoid creating bad memories.
Looking for continuing education credits? Check out the SilviCast webpage for more information. And now, back to our show.
I don't want to get too far into this topic, but I would be remiss in not asking about this. But
Are you going to go there, Greg?
how does,
all right.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's part of this good and bad memories. How does deer play into all of this?
Yeah.
They're a native species, right? And we want them or need them in our systems, but they also can create maybe bad memories as well. Like, how does that play into, particularly in our northern hardwood forests?
Yeah, so they're a challenging species in a lot of ways. They're a wonderful resource. It's probably one of the most successful kind of wildlife restorations that I can think of anyways, and probably, globally even, from being extirpated from a lot of the Midwest to now being, abundant in most places,
Right.
some places really overabundant. So the way I think about whitetails is that, that all of our systems that we work in the North Woods here and throughout the eastern US co-evolved with whitetail deer. And so there's some level of herbivory, which is actually really desirable in those systems to kind of maintain diversity. And so some level of herbivory is kind of a good memory in that system. It's like having an appropriate disturbance regime or having fire in some of our fire dominated systems. The problem that we have is in a lot of places that we have levels of herbivory that are higher than what the system evolved with. The other thing that happens with herbivory is that some cases we may not have that many deer, but we've done things to that system that actually make it more vulnerable to negative impacts of herbivory. And so sometimes that can be, past peaks in abundance. We may have had really high populations for a while that really degraded the system. And now once you degrade the system, it doesn't take very much herbivory to kind of keep it in a pretty depauperate state. And so you see that after you have like a big eruption in deer populations, you lose all your hemlock and cedar from your understories. It takes decades and decades to build that back, or you lose herbaceous plants like trilliums out of a system. Trilliums are super slow at recolonization, so those might be gone for a long time. And so it's really hard to kind of rebuild some of those memories, like advanced regeneration of palatable conifers, when you have these kind of pulses of deer abundance. And so I think the real challenge is kind of finding or understanding the level of abundance that's appropriate kind of in the contemporary landscape, and then also appreciating that that varies greatly spatially. You can have, one area where you have, kind of an appropriate level of deer abundance, and you can be a few miles away and then have problems, right? You can have regeneration failures or real challenges. And so, it's not uniform across the landscape in terms of that impact. And I do think it's kind of a real challenge kind of figure out kind of what the appropriate level of abundance is in some of these systems, especially since we've changed them. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we've also influenced, with agriculture on the landscape. We can carry more deer in a lot of areas than we could historically, but the forest is, not necessarily on board with that. But sometimes agriculture can actually take some pressure off the forest as well. And so it gets quite complicated when you start kind of trying to unravel kind of the landscape of deer overabundance.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Chris, it makes me think about situations, and this again is maybe a little bit of where I live. I think a lot of our forests here are like here in Wisconsin, we talk about central hardwood stands, and it's our cover type that it's really not oak and it's really not maple, but it's somewhere kind of like that. The whole successional trajectories, we're really not quite sure exactly where it's going if you don't have those shade tolerant components, you don't have oak in there, which is really new, right? Like that's not something that would have been on the landscape a lot historically, but now we're working with this new system. So how does ecological memory come into play with maybe like these novel situations that we're in now? How should we be approaching or thinking about ecological memory in that context?
So one of the things with the loss of ecological memory is that we can transition to novel systems. And I think you can find a lot of examples around the landscape of relatively novel conditions, forest types that didn't occur historically, mixtures of species that really don't have any prior analog, or at least in terms of the proportions of abundance. And so I think there's some opportunities there to think about kind of applying, kind of ecological silviculture in terms of thinking about how do we're not going to move those systems necessarily back to kind of what they were prior to European settlement or, even what they were, maybe a few decades ago. But how do we kind of use some of the concepts of kind of ecological memory to enhance resilience and kind of think about how we're going to, transition those forests to kind of, I think we called this in the paper tolerable
Yeah.
novel systems.
Yeah.
And so, can we still basically maintain kind of ecosystem goods and services that are really vital? Can we still maintain kind of timber products which are useful? And how do we do that kind of in this novel system that, we have to apply some kind of ecological knowledge to think about how it works, but we're not going to really be able to restore it to what it was prior.
Right.
There's definitely, I think, some things we can do to try to work on that.
I like that approach because sometimes it's really obvious, like that you can't go back to a certain situation, but in many situations, we might be tweaking. Everything might look very similar, but it can never be exactly what it was. But we can still use the principles to kind of get behind it and say, yeah, we could still emulate or mimic or kind of restore some of these things and still improve them.
Yeah, and kind of restore and maintain process, right? Or
Right.
maintain kind of the resilience of the system. The thing that's really challenging, I think, in some of these forests is that, you end up, in the case of some of our northern hardwood forests where you have a sedge understory,
Right.
a maple overstory, and no regeneration taking place, that, it's really not entirely clear. Well, unfortunately, when you harvest, often you end up with sedge, ironwood, raspberry. It's really going to take, I think, some thought and some creativity to think about how to maintain maple on that landscape. Or do we start to move some of those systems towards other species? Maybe, red oak, maybe species which are less sensitive to competition from sedge or competition from or the interactions with earthworms in the soil in those systems.
That kind of gets us, Chris, into maybe some of the silvicultural things that we can do to try to restore ecological memory to a system, or at least prevent bad ones from accumulating through the management that we do. And so I guess I'd like to talk about maybe what foresters might be able to do to restore some elements. And I think about in the context again of northern hardwoods, you mentioned it, coarse woody debris, for example. Is that something that I think foresters could implement more into their management to try to maintain it, protect it, or enhance it? Would that be an example of a place that we could kind of restore some memory to a system?
Yeah, no, definitely. Coarse weight debris, there's been a lot of research on this, but coarse weight debris tends to be much less abundant, especially large diameter coarse weight debris and highly decayed coarse weight debris in managed forest than in old growth forest. And it does provide, a whole host of kind of ecological benefits in terms of microsites for establishment for certain tree species, so things like yellow birch. And some trees are pretty picky, actually, in terms of the type of coarse weight debris they like to grow on. So, yellow birch likes conifer logs, and so does hemlock. Hemlock actually likes to regenerate on hemlock logs, or pine. They won't regenerate on maple logs that much. And so, kind of paying attention to kind of what kind of coarse weight debris you're creating too, I think is important. But ecologically, for a whole host of organisms, yeah, we could leave more coarse weight debris behind, and especially larger diameter stuff, which I know is a challenge, right? In terms of, you know, leaving behind kind of the saw log out of a tree. But I think there are opportunities where there's a lot of stuff that we're dragging to the landing, ending up leaving at the landing, or larger diameter stuff that's, almost too big for pulp, that we're still trying to kind of truck out these big hollow logs. There's probably a lot of opportunity to kind of be more creative or thoughtful in terms of what we're leaving behind. One other thing we've been kind of playing around with up here at the Ford Forestry Center is also creating artificial tip-up mounds, because that's something that, a lot of these systems were wind driven. And so tip-up mounds are pretty important for kind of regeneration sites, for establishment. When we're anticipating mortality and we're thinning and tending these stands, we don't get a lot of blowdown. We might get some tops breaking out, but we're not getting a lot of trees tipping over. And so we're not creating that kind of soil disturbance that would have been associated with tip-up mounds.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that you can do. We played around with having a processor do it, with kind of pulling the trees out of the ground and flipping them over. A lot of them, unfortunately, flip back into the hole. But there's been some work out east where they've done that with, heavy equipment, like bulldozers or things like that. And you can't get them inverted in a way where they're going to stay put. But I think there's some things like that we could think about with our forest management where, we can be a little bit messy and give ourselves permission to do that, or maybe be messy in an aesthetically pleasing way, but thinking about kind of leaving some of that, especially larger diameter wood behind, and leaving, some different microsites.
Mm-hmm. I like the messy, but you're giving yourself permission to be creative too.
Yeah.
Kind of identifying the issue and then trying something to see how it works. I'm curious, Chris, what did you guys decide on as the best way to tip trees over?
So probably not what we did. No, actually, what we did worked okay, but we had basically the operator, pull the tree out of the ground, and there's a limit to what they're willing to do with a processor.
Oh, right.
Those are very expensive pieces of equipment. The thing that we realized pretty quickly was that if you are kind of inverting a tree or pulling it out of the ground, you actually have to leave some bollwood on there. The more bollwood you leave, the less likely it is to kind of flip back into the hole. So a lot of ours ended up kind of flipping back onto the root plate or flipping back into the hole. The ones that had a little bit more stem left on them, those stayed in place pretty well. And we did see actually some, even after just a few years, some pretty meaningful differences in terms of species composition, on mounds versus off of the mounds. I think there are probably some ways that we could do that, maybe in conjunction with road work or things like that in these stands, where we're actually thinking a little bit more carefully about kind of inverting them. What we did worked pretty well from a research standpoint, but to kind of do it at scale, especially at scale with really expensive equipment and operators that might be leery about, kind of trying to wrench a large tree out of the ground.
Yep.
I think there's definitely some advances we could make there.
We've had that conversation with salvage operations, and that might be an obvious opportunity to retain some tip-up mounds, and that exact same experience, whereas if you cut the bollwood off, the root wad tips back into the hole. And I could see, and we've had foresters do this, to identify a certain percentage or certain trees where they're going to leave some coarse woody debris on site and keep that tip-up mound intact. So
Greg, you may recall John Schwartzman and Board of Commissioners of Public Lands. They did some work where they actually took lower value wood, put it behind the mound, and then they could cut it up fairly short, but it wouldn't flip back down in. So it kind of had something to hold it up. Not like the, like the traditional like trap, like not pointing it up that, but kind of wedged in behind it. So it just didn't have a way to come down.
Cool. That sounds like a really neat idea.
But I think that's a call out to the SilviCast community, Chris and Greg, that if you guys are doing something where you're preserving those or try it, we should let us all know, because I think we could all learn from it.
Yeah, definitely.
And I guess this is something in northern hardwoods. So downed wood as a part of a harvest, I think that's really good. But it seems like we don't often do a lot of artificial regeneration in these situations where we can get obvious natural regeneration, right? We're going for that. So it feels to me like this is a kind of a call out to identify, are you lacking certain species or in your diversity of overstory, and maybe think about maybe doing some planting to encourage species diversity, both at the ground and in the overstory?
Yeah, no, you could definitely think about kind of enrichment planting in some of these systems, and especially in canopy gaps, they're, kind of creating the right environment, and then, putting species in places where they're likely to be successful. We could think probably more about, tree shelters are really expensive, but, there's some things we could do probably in terms of, it's a fun term. It's called dead hedging, but people have tried this a little bit where you basically pile brush, but you pile it really intentionally to basically make, a bit of a crib that you can plant in. That's something that, slash walls are, often you don't end up with enough slash to really create a lot of slash walls in northern hardwood management because we're recovering pulpwood. But thinking kind of creatively about how we might be able to kind of pile some of the slash that we do have in ways that facilitate planting. So I think there's some opportunities there to kind of think creatively. The other thing which I think about a lot in these systems is really making sure we retain the diversity we do have. And then, that we target our regeneration activities really kind of spatially and think about, if you have just a little bit of yellow birch in the stand, you can use that kind of as a group shelter wood. Kind of thinking about, well, we're not going to regenerate yellow birch 300 yards from that patch of yellow birch, but adjacent to that patch of yellow birch, we might be able to. Same with scattered white pine, creating openings proximate to them, scarifying the soil. Also really paying attention to the timing of seed set for some of these species. I'm sure you guys have witnessed this a lot too, where you see a great silvicultural system, but you don't end up with any seed, right? Like the oak, it's not a good mast year.
Right.
Or, you create some openings and scarify them, and then the birch really didn't produce much seed that year. And so really trying to pay attention to kind of, or being more flexible in terms of, I guess, our timing, in terms of thinking about, kind of preparing a stand, but then holding back on some of those treatments until we have an adequate cone crop or an adequate seed crop.
I really like that, Chris, about thinking about what you have existing in your stand for species diversity and trying to, as you said, target that or enhance that in some ways. I think a lot of times that's sort of an afterthought. We think about, okay, we got our prescription on this, and this is how we're going to regenerate the majority of the species, but we aren't recognizing maybe some of those species that are more minor components of the stand for whatever reason, and looking at trying to enhance that and keep that seed source around and enhance it by maybe crop tree releasing and getting those crowns bigger, or as you said, shelter wood. I just think that's an area that we could focus a lot more on.
Yeah, it's kind of really taking a look at, kind of what you have and where you have it. And, I often tell students that, when we go out, we have this big experiment called NH-Seed at the Ford Forestry Center. And there's always a tendency to want to pick like the best system out of it. Was it the high residual shelter wood, the low residual shelter wood, or is it the gap study next door? And what I encourage students to think about is, well, probably some combination of all of this is probably the best system. We really have a tendency to kind of try to pick a winner and just go with it. But then we end up applying a system kind of, across stand types or across kind of changes in composition where it might not make a lot of sense. And so I really like the idea of kind of, especially in the context of ecological forestry, of really thinking about kind of the silvicultural toolbox really holistically and kind of thinking about within a particular management unit where we normally would prescribe like a certain, like just one thing, really thinking, well, is there a way that we can be more creative in what we do? Can we keep track of it in a way that's meaningful so that we know we can learn from what we've done, that we actually kind of can increase knowledge, and also we can keep track from a, I guess, a managerial standpoint that we know kind of something about our future harvest and knowing that we're doing things sustainably, but thinking creatively about kind of how we apply those tools, across a landscape or even within a stand.
I think about that conversation we had, Brad, with Ralph Nyland, and he didn't use those terms of ecological memory and such, but it was more of a conversation about restoration and using restorative silvicultural practices, and he used the term multi-treatment silviculture, basically saying the same thing you're saying, Chris, is to restore these stands that are degraded or have lost memory. We really are probably doing lots of different things on a scale of a stand to try to accommodate for these different aspects that we're talking about here.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about how many times have you guys walked into a stand, you look at a prescription and you look at something and go, well, that's not what they did here. And then someone says, well, it wasn't exactly like that here, so we had to do something different. And so it's kind of embracing in some ways, like maybe in reinforcing, like that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. Just react to what you're seeing. And Greg, it reminds me of our friends in Canada talk about micro stands, seeing lots of different things happening within an area. Or even Mike Demchek, UW-Stevens Point, talks about that idea of kind of approaching things, micro stands within the stand, and having different ways you would approach things depending upon what you actually come upon in a stand, which feels like it lends itself to some of that diversity.
Yeah.
Chris, I'm thinking about what you had said earlier about the importance of the understory and how things really happen there. So are there silvicultural treatments we can do to help restore memory to some of those understories? Because it's not something that we typically are focused on. And maybe it's stuff we do like site preparation to get regeneration, but what should we be thinking about with trying to restore memory to the understory?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a few things we can do. Some of the loss of memory, that we see like in the herbaceous layer, there are things we can do kind of, I love that term restorative silviculture, but there are things we could do in terms of some restoration in those systems. There's also things we can do in terms of thinking carefully about how we put management on the landscape and seasonal timing, kind of trying to find windows where we're not necessarily, going to degrade the system or lead to compaction. The other thing which, study we did not too long ago with trilliums at that NH-seed experiment was, it turns out that, as long as you don't scarify right over a patch of trillium, it doesn't really care that much about what you've done to the overstory. And so just being really thoughtful in terms of how we apply some of these treatments, in terms of like scarification, which can be really useful for regenerating a lot of species, and we're not getting a lot of soil disturbance in some of these systems, but also thinking careful about where do we actually put the soil disturbance. You don't want to, scarify out of existence, the one patch of trillium that you had in your stand that was going to be the seed source to, recolonize other areas in the stand. And so I think in terms of the understory for herbaceous plants, it's thinking kind of about what we have and where we have things. Deer, of course, are a huge issue in terms of the herbaceous layer, but then it's looking at competitive dynamics too. So there are certain species that have done really well, like sedge, following our management, following earthworms, and obviously interactions with deer as well. And so we have to think, well, do we really target kind of our activities in the understory to kind of relieve pressure from some of those species? And so kind of, I guess, in terms of restoring memory in the understory is really thinking pretty spatially and thinking kind of at a fine scale about what we have, making sure that we don't degrade what we have, but then also looking for opportunities to basically maybe tip competitive dynamics with scarification or herbicides, towards a more diverse suite of species.
I don't know if maybe this is that can of worms that, well, okay, not can of worms because we already talked about worms, but
they released the worms from
yeah,
the can. That was the problem, Brad.
yeah. All right. So we won't open that can. What about how does climate change kind of figure in with some of this? I kind of get the sense that we're probably going to say this, but how would you approach like climate change thinking about ecological memory?
Yeah, so I guess the way I've been kind of thinking about it is that, and especially this gets back to Greg's point about kind of what we might plant.
Yeah.
If you are thinking about, kind of enrichment plantings, I think it's important to think about kind of the traits that you want in the system. And so the types of traits, types of qualities in terms of the plant community that you're looking for kind of meeting a whole range of values, right? From wildlife to uh, you know, forest products to,
Hmm.
aesthetics. And so thinking about kind of, well, how do we adapt some of these systems? If we are having trouble regenerating the current species mix, what traits do we want to identify in species that maybe we can move in? And so are we doing some assisted migration? Are we just moving things just a little bit north? Or are we just moving things from a different part of the landscape where they're currently at because they're not in this stand yet?
Hmm.
Or are we, simply trying to favor certain genotypes within stands? We may already have some genotypes that are pretty well adapted to a future climate. And so trying to pay attention to, species that seem to be performing well given changing conditions, and then or individuals even within a population that aren't performing well.
Hmm.
Trying to think about kind of how do we adapt these systems. They're definitely going to change. And so I think the thing with ecological memory is really kind of, or even ecological silviculture too, is really thinking about kind of how do we maintain resilience? And resilience means that we need, species that basically can respond and rebound following disturbance, that can maintain forest cover, that can maintain kind of a desirable kind of mix of traits and, services and goods from the system. Yeah, unfortunately, the genie's out of the bottle when it comes to
Hmm.
climate change. And so, these systems are responding. And the question is, can we get them to respond in a way that is tolerable, right? That is
Yeah.
something that, or even desirable in terms of the potential future species mix.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what you were saying, Brad, about novel systems. And,
Hmm.
we may be more in the future dealing with some of those novel systems. And as you said, Chris, how can we look at those and try to maybe maintain the structure and function of those things, even though
Right.
they may not look exactly the same as the original?
And that is interesting though, because like when you think about some of the discussions about assisted migration, I haven't heard anyone really say that. You hear about will it survive in this area or, but you don't really hear about does it play well in this system? Is it adapted to, kind of working with memories that we might have in an area? So I think that's really interesting. That could be really useful as we go forward. Yeah.
So as we think about like hard mast in some of these systems, so we've lost a lot of mass production from American beech due to beech bark disease and then potentially beech leaf disease. And so, thinking about oaks in those systems, or maybe oaks that are even a little bit further south, that may basically provide that service, but then work and play well with the species that we currently have in the mix.
Yeah.
So one thing I've been thinking about a lot since the field tours for the Wisconsin Society of American Foresters is thinking about some of the ICO treatments and some of the things that we looked at in the field, which really got me thinking about, it's not just looking forward about where we can move these systems to, it's also looking back to learn more about how these systems worked and if there are certain structures and patterns that actually may be desirable to restore because they're going to increase resilience in these systems or bring resilience back in a way that we've lost because we've modified kind of the structure of these systems, or we've lost certain disturbances like frequent fire, which may be coming back and
Hmm.
maybe something that we can use in a more creative way to make these systems more resilient. And so, yeah, some of those treatments, thinking about like the spacing of red pine and kind of what those stands would have looked like historically, or oak systems, and that you start to really think it through and you realize that maybe these even age stands that we have of red pine are actually pretty novel.
Yeah.
Or maybe some of our even age oak systems are actually pretty novel in terms of the disturbance regime that would have promoted those species historically. And so, yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot since those field tours that, maybe we have to kind of think creatively about using like a fresh look at kind of historically how these systems work, but without the idea of like we're going to make a museum piece and go back in time,
Hmm.
but thinking more carefully about kind of the structures that allow these systems to work and accepting maybe that what we're working with is actually pretty novel.
Hmm. I think our silviculture has strived towards uniformity and maybe at the expense of diversity. And so what you're saying is it's not necessarily that we can't stop working towards production of services and goods coming out of these forests, but just thinking about how to maybe maintain the capability within these systems to have diverse species, diverse structure, and diverse function.
Yeah.
I just like that way of thinking of ecological memory, that way of it just helps me think about maybe what things have been lost from the system or what things could be possible within this system, and then trying to build that into the silviculture.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, whenever I hear terms like spatial heterogeneity, I think, oh, that's not for me. But ecological memory, that I can understand, I get like, oh, here's what it kind of did before, and here's how we can bring that forward. So I think this whole concept is going to be, I think it just makes it much more approachable and maybe more applicable to people in the field. So I'm going to start using the term a lot more in the future.
So Chris, first, thank you for giving the presentation on this at the SAF statewide.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
That was great. And thank you again for talking with us about this idea and just bringing it to other people.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun talking and meeting with people at SAF. This has been a great conversation today.
I always tell people, Chris, that Michigan Tech is actually Wisconsin's third state school. You guys just don't know it yet. We don't give you any money, but we claim it. So
we do have a lot of people who got degrees from Wisconsin universities up here as well. So
yeah, we hire our fair share of Michigan Tech people. So
yep, that's right.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, guys.
We'll be talking to you in the future. Brad, I love learning new terminology. I'm going to use that one, especially that idea about good and bad memories in a forest.
I agree. And that's why it's time to take a ride on the old Silvosaurus. Yes, it's that time again. Time for Silvictionary.
I got a word today I'm going to surprise you with.
Oh, all right.
I was reading an old publication. That's the hint. And I came across this term, and I want to see if you know what it means.
Oh, boy. There's a good chance I don't, Greg.
The word is butter churn butt.
Butter churn butt. Now, let's just keep this above the board here. Everything is, we're having a good time. There's no need for, all right. So butter churn butt, I bet that is a term referring to kind of like a sugar maple that might have a Coke bottle form to it. So I bet it's a defect in a tree.
Well, it is a defect in a tree, but I wouldn't say it's the Coke bottle, kind of the...
No, not the Coke bottle, but maybe like some version of like a butter churn.
Well, think, Brad.
I don't even know what a butter churn looks like.
You're old. Think, what is a butter churn?
Yeah. Well, let me see if I can get that tri-corner hat out, Greg, and see if we can figure that out. I don't know. What does a butter churn look like?
A butter churn is it's like a ceramic pot, and it's big, has a big opening, and you take the big stick and you churn the butter back and forth and all around.
Oh, so it's a cavity in a tree.
Bingo.
Oh.
Bingo. So it's the cavity in the base of a tree. So the butt log down towards the bottom, when you get, it looks like a pot.
Yep.
Maybe it was a double stem, and they cut one of the stems and then one of them rotted away, and the tree sort of grew around and formed a pot around the base. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yep. So what was the term again? Butter churn.
Butter churn butts.
Butter churn butts. All right. Well, our challenge today is to use that in conversation about forestry.
Half the listeners will be going, I don't even know what a butter churn is.
Yeah, well,
Doesn't butter come from the grocery store?
yeah. It's a new one.
Okay, that's all I got.
Well, thanks for listening to today's episode of SilviCast. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. You can reach us at UW-Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question or comment if you like. We'll put you in SilviCast. And always remember, we learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
Take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Joe Rogers, our IT master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW-Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.